Good afternoon.
Member of Knesset Yair Lapid and founder and chairperson of the Yesh Atid party, former Minister of Finance, MK Lapid, started his political career in 2012 upon the foundation, the establishment of his party. He serves as an MK since the elections held that year. Before entering the political world, MK Lapid was a journalist, a news anchor, and an author. In this framework, he had a weekly column in the Yediot Achronot newspaper and published 11 books. Many of them have become bestsellers. I am honored to invite MK Yair Lapid to give his address. Good morning. The fundamental question upon which I wish to discuss things with you is what is the role of the political echelon when faced with security questions in Israel, with an emphasis of the role of the Prime Minister? What function actually is the Prime Minister supposed to play? But in order to answer this, we have to first of all go to an even earlier fundamental question, and that is, what is the security goal of the State of Israel? What is its main goal? And the simple answer is that, and it hasn't changed much since the Iron Wall of Jabotinsky, following which we had the well-known security document of Ben Gurion from 1953. Our main security goal is to make sure that Israel is so strong and powerful that its power would be so clear that its enemies would know in advance that they're bound to lose no matter what battle they open against it. Behind this perception, behind this organizing concept, there is a different specs every time, or a different mix every time. It can be, guns from the Czech Republic or Iron Dome. It can be the alliance with Great Britain and France in the Sinai operation, and it can be our historic covenant with the US, and it can be a peace with Jordan and Egypt, or the nuclear reactor in Dimona. The result should always be the very same one. Israel must have disproportionate power in order to rise to the challenges it has, so that we get to this holy square of the Israeli security: deterrence, early warning, decision, and defense that was added later on. And such a power would prevent most conflicts from erupting, and it would allow us to shorten the campaigns that are bound to break out, and that is the prerequisite in order to reach any future agreement in the Middle East. There's no agreement that we will ever sign that would have any meaning whatsoever unless we have this continuous power to defend ourselves. And if this is the main goal, then that is also the main role of the political echelon, and that is to build this power, to maintain this power, to understand profoundly that all those ingredients comprising this power. The role of the Prime Minister and the political echelon is not to stand on a hilltop after a terror attack surrounded by, military officers, maps and binoculars. That perhaps looks good, but this can be done by any deputy battalion commander, and they can do it even better. The role of the Prime Minister is to define the strategic goals and to build the power that would allow these to be implemented. The ones who said this recently were people belonging to the military echelons. In the strategy document, the Chief of the General Staff, Isaac wrote that the political echelon should define the goals for the army according to the following guidelines. What are the goals and the required strategic end states? What is the role of the military and how does it fit in with achieving these goals? Number 3, what are the constraints of military power? And number 4, define the other endeavors, the political, the social, the media roles, and the role of the IDF in them. in his very matter-of-fact way, Eisenkot formulated it or worded it in such a non-dramatic way that we might miss the drama. There is a first-of-its-kind statement made by the army that is begging the political echelon, almost begging the political echelon to do its job, to define goals, to put some order into things, to operate as a state that has an army, not an army that has a state. In order for that to happen, the political echelon needs to, first of all, deal with the creation of Israeli power. The prime minister does not only draw its power from the army, it only provides it with its power. And the right model is of a joint power or smart power. As Professor Joseph Ney, he was the assistant to the Secretary of State. And he defines three generators: the military power, the social economic power, and the strategic alliances that make up its political or diplomatic power. And I would like to explain something on the micro level that would explain the macro level. Let's just look at the F-35 deal. Prima facie, what we're seeing is a pure military deal, but the way by which we reached it is a perfect illustration of the principle of smart power. First of all, the fact that Israel can at all afford to buy those 50 most expensive, combat planes without this impacting the state budget or its economic robustness. Why? Because we are a strong economy, a technologically characterized economy, and we can actually look at things 10 years ahead. And it's an economy in which the IAI is building the wing of the plane and Elbit is building the helmet of the pilot. Number two, because Israel is a legitimate country on the, diplomatic level. Sudan would not receive the necessary, confirmation to get the F-35 because it is not committed to the international law and it's not a legitimate country. And the same applies for Iran and other countries. So the only country in the Middle East beside us that received the approval to buy the jet is Turkey, which has been a member in NATO since 1952, and upon whose land there is an American base that has 90 American nuclear bombs. Moreover, Israel is buying this, aircraft from the, a security aid that it gets from the Americans, and that perpetuates our alliance with the Americans, who serve as our foundation of security. So if I go back to the main goal that I started with, some of the reasons why our enemies are telling themselves that they would always lose any battle against us has to do with the historic memory of that airlift in the Yom Kippur War that brought with it the understanding that in real time the U.S. would never allow Israel to lose in any war. A part of the role of the political echelon is to actually guard this historic pact. We have to make sure that we guard our, interest here, but we should always remember that the special relations with the U.S. are, in and of themselves, one of the most vital interests that we have. And in order to, guard them, we have to work properly with the U.S. jury and make sure that we stay a non-partisan. We do not belong neither to the Republicans or the Democratic constituency. We're everyone's. And to make sure that a president like the new president, Trump, who says out loud that what he cares about is only the American interest, that he should know that Israel is the front post of the West, of democracy, of the rule of law, of the International Counterterrorism Act. The last component of the model of this smart power is Israeli society. When the government of the State of Israel buys 50 expensive jets, it actually appeals to the Israeli public and asks it to forego smaller classrooms or, ERs in the periphery. So that this request would be positively answered, this social covenant has to work. What allows the building of this power is the fundamental trust, bestowed by the citizen in the government, the ability of every citizen to tell himself or herself, I do not know the details, but I trust the Prime Minister and I trust the cabinet. The Israeli public should know and should be convinced that its interests have been taken into account. If the public thinks, even for one moment, that instead of a responsible consideration, the political echelon are merely dealing with political survival, or that, God forbid, their own good, the entire national resilience is going to be harmed. The components of power that I've just described around the Adir F-35 plane are an illustration of a general model. That's the classical model of that joint or smart power. Usually the cogwheels are hidden from the eyes of the public. The ones who should look at this entire complex is the senior political echelon. Its main goal, main goal of the Prime Minister, actually, is to create an ongoing process of force design, not just the military force, but also the economic, social, political force that would allow that military power. And that sounds trivial, perhaps, but it's the furthest it can be from trivial, because that necessitates daily decisions which are not easy to make. Of all the roles of the Prime Minister in Israel, the most challenging one is the one that does not appear in the law book. To navigate constantly between contradictory interests. In almost every decision that is brought before the Prime Minister, there's always a clash of conflicts. When you pave a road in the south, you probably do not do this in the north. And everyone wants to lower the cost of living, no problem. You can always do away with all the taxes and actually flood the country with cheap import, and the cost of living would immediately drop. But then thousands of farmers would lose their industries and plants would close down, and hundreds of thousands of people would become unemployed. The same applies for the international arena. If you tightened your relation with Russia, you have to pay a price in the US, and so on and so forth. And the convenient solution is both to say, give me all, security, education, economy, reckless war, and international trust. But there's no such reality in the real world, because we live in a world of limited resources and contradictory interests. And the role of the leadership is to maintain a profound discussion and examine the pros and cons, and then to make decisions that some people would not like. It's not a simple process. There's always a political price. But that is the essence of the role of the leadership, and that's the essence of the role of the Prime Minister. Building this joint power, this smart power, necessitates a very broad view and the ability to make decisions. The question whether to go for an operation or instruct the Mossad to eliminate someone is a very important question, but the Prime Minister cannot reduce its role only to the operational level. It's not a coincidence that the Prime Minister is not, situated in the Kiryah. No, not in Tel Aviv. He is in Jerusalem, from which he has to navigate the entire sphere, so that the foci of power of the State of Israel would not contradict one another, but rather work in an integrated way to advance the interest of the country. Years of bad habits and avoiding taking responsibility by the political echelon made us, think that the security establishment and the IDF are the ones that should provide the political echelon with a proper hierarchy of threats and a proper analysis of the security and political environment that we operate in, and even the entire spectrum of political and economic calculations. It should be the other way around. The security establishment should provide the best intel it can provide, and we should listen to it with, taking this with a grain of salt. That's very healthy when it comes to its estimates. But the Prime Minister, as well as the Cabinet, are the ones that should set the policy. The Prime Minister should shape the policy according to that smart power principle and make sure that every component, every ingredient of the system would actually be integrated. The key element is the NSC. Since its inception, it had undergone many changes and revolutions, but it is today, more than ever before, that it is the weakest. Since December 2015, nobody has the NSC. The case of the submarines and the ships actually casts a very dark, shade over the NSC. The Prime Minister is mostly involved in political survival, so there's no strategic staff work, and that creates a pit, a void in the work of the political echelon. Based on my experience in the cabinet, I can attest that it does not allow it to be a body that makes informed decisions or even hold in-depth discussions. And because there's no vacuum in the world that is not being filled up, then any of the security agencies, be it the ISA or the Mossad or anyone else, start defining their own policy. This is not a healthy situation. None of the security agencies can be fully aware of all the considerations of the state and the updated diplomatic reality or the social complexities. It's not their role. The IDF shouldn't be involved in defining the long-term strategic goals of the State of Israel, which include technological theaters in topics such as social cohesion and foreign relations. That's not its role. What the Prime Minister needs to have beside it is organizational capability and culture that would allow him to make security decisions based on as broad a perspective as possible. This need existed since the establishment of the state, but it grows bigger and bigger. The political security environment has changed drastically in the last few years. We live in a totally different reality today, different to the one that we've grown accustomed to in the first 60 years of this country. Our enemies are no longer states or regular armies, and in their stead, what we're facing is an era of civil wars and coups and terror organizations that improve greatly and truly gain, global power and cyber warfare and nuclear aspirations of more than one country and an international front that is highly impacted by hostile media toward Israel and radical human rights organizations. So properly analyzing reality cannot remain in air photos of missiles. It has to include history, religion, culture, the regime, components of the economy, the social powers. It was always complicated, but in this last decade, it has grown to be even more complicated than ever before. The revolution of the social media started in 2006. The economic crisis of 2008 can still be felt. The Arab Spring started in 2010 and since then turned into a very, very lengthy autumn. It turned out once again that the Middle East believes in a different way, namely that violence can be an available, reasonable solution for any problem. We have enemies with mentality of the 11th century holding weapons of the 21st century. Even the tools of analysis become a lot more complex and sophisticated. In this new world in which we live, there's no longer any separation between days of peace and days of war. When faced with this reality, Israel will always need to be powerful, and it would have to have a lot of power. And this power can not only be brutal power, it has to be smart power. Even in the field of security, the world moves from a topical perspective to a network perspective. General McChrysty says, it takes a network to defeat a network. And in order for our network to be better than their network, studying the enemy as well as the players in the region, which aren't necessarily enemies, cannot be limited to one truth or one layer of information. The Prime Minister has to build a work environment in which the army, the ISA, the Mossad, a strong Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a powerful NSC are synchronized and complement one another, and economic and social professionals would be a part of the discussion. The fact that the political echelon today spills over constantly from the strategy to the tactical level and from the macro to the micro is perhaps human and inevitable. Most people would rather do that which they know and understand. And when it comes to the political aspect, dealing with tactics is a lot more rewarding and convenient than dealing with strategy whose fruits would be picked one day in the future or, God forbid, by someone else. And it is exactly because of that the role of the Prime Minister is to make sure that the political echelon would be very meticulous in dealing with the foundations of smart power and not necessarily in operational matters only. We have no shortage of talented commanders. We have a very, very severe shortage in leaders who behave like leaders. What we have seen in the cabinet, in Operation Protective Edge, and what appears, clearly in the report of the state controllers cannot repeat itself. We saw a prime minister that, sort of sinks in endless technical discussions in order to avoid making a decision. We saw an ongoing preoccupation with politics during the a time of war. There's no place for politics in times of war. The IDF is the best army in the world, but it has to have political leadership that knows what it wants and knows how to lead processes. The army cannot operate without commands. It cannot win unless targets are defined for it. When the leadership stammers, when it doesn't know what it wants, the army cannot operate. When the prime minister attempts to hide the truth from the public, he hurts the ability of the army and does not allow it to draw lessons and to improve for the next operation. The power of the IDF relies on its combat doctrine and its ongoing willingness to improve. The situation today is that people hide instead of correcting the situation. They do not speak the truth to improve. They deal with politics instead of preparing the future campaign. The proper situation is that tactical discussions should not at all be held with the Prime Minister, and strategic discussions have to go through the NSC. And the role of the NSC is to bring together all the information, all the staff work, and integrate it for the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. It is even more so in times of routine, not in times of emergency, because that is the time that policy should be formulated in. Discussing a topic such as the security or the defense budget cannot be led by the IDF, because then it would end up in the perpetual discussion between the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Defense. A discussion of the day after Abu Mazen cannot remain in the ISA or COGAT. It has to be a comprehensive discussion whose insights would be political, not merely operational. And the question, what do we want to happen in Gaza? This question should not be discussed when we have a conflict in Gaza. It has to be held much before that. So governmental systems cannot operate without a leadership that knows what it wants. So very often, I, called people around me. I read the moon speech given by President Kennedy. We choose to go to the moon, he said. We choose to go to the moon. And all those experts reprimanded Kennedy for setting a goal that there's no doubt that the U.S. would fail in achieving it. But their energetic young president understood that leadership means setting high goals and then endlessly striving to achieve them. I'm a great believer in the power of the individual, the power of a very resolved leadership to shape the course of history and not to give in to it, in the fact that democracy is a mode of government at whose foundation lies optimism. The fact that at the head of the pyramid, we have to see a person that can lead people to places they never deemed were possible before. We should pay attention to the fact that President Kennedy never said in his speech, I am going to reach the moon. He said, we will reach the moon. In order to implement the national tasks and the most important goals of the country, in order to defend its security and navigate between the different threats, the Prime Minister has to do, first and foremost, to make sure that there is a team of talented, committed people with independent opinions about him to provide him with the informative infrastructure, the ideas, the very meticulous staff work that would allow the country to move forward and prosper and be safe. It is not the situation today. This is what we aspire for, and this is what we can bring to Israeli leadership. Thank you very much.